Do you remember the feeling? Sitting on the living room floor, controller in hand, and the only rule was walk to the right and beat up everything that moved. There were no complex tutorials, no giant skill trees. It was just you, your reflexes, and a horde of pixelated enemies. Today, in a world of ultra-realistic graphics and complicated mechanics, it's easy to forget the purity and genius of the early days. But what if I told you that in many ways that 8-bit beat-em-up wasn't just simpler, but better? Get ready for a time travel, because today we're going to prove this theory. I'm Matthew, and this is the list of 10 8-bit beat-em-ups that prove that beat-em-ups were better back in the day. When I think of Kageki, the first thing that comes to mind isn't a street brawl with gangs, but something more intimate and brutal, almost like a martial arts movie from the 80s. This Taito game didn't put you against endless hordes of weak enemies. It focused on more measured and technical duels. The feeling was that each enemy was a mini-boss, a challenge that required your full attention. The sprites were large for the time, which gave incredible weight and impact to every punch and kick. It wasn't about clearing the screen, it was about surviving the next confrontation. The gameplay was unique. You had a punch button and a kick button, but the magic was in how they interacted with your position. You could deliver high and low strikes, and defense was crucial. Kageki taught you not to mash buttons. You had to observe the opponent's pattern, block at the right time, and counterattack in the window of opportunity. This more methodical approach, almost a precursor to one-on-one fighting games, set it apart from all others. The beat-em-up here was cerebral, a violent dance of attack and defense that rewarded patience as much as aggression. And that's exactly why Kageki proves that beat-em-ups were better back then. It trusted the player's intelligence. There were no bright arrows or automatic combos. The game gave you a simple set of tools and expected you to learn to use them masterfully. The satisfaction of defeating an enemy didn't come from a flashy special effect, but from knowing that you had outmaneuvered them strategically, that you had read their moves and applied the right strike at the right time. It was a raw, honest, and extremely rewarding experience that focused 100% on combat quality. Double Dragon isn't just a game, it's ground zero for the golden age of beat-em-ups. When Technos Japan released this title in arcades in 1987, they didn't just create a spiritual successor to Renegade, they defined virtually every convention the genre would follow for years to come. The home versions for NES and Master System brought this revolution into the home, each with their own unique quirks and charms that still make us sigh with nostalgia today. The genius of Double Dragon was in its ability to tell a cinematic story through action. The cutscenes, something revolutionary for the time, gave emotional context to every punch and kick. Seeing Marion get punched in the stomach and kidnapped in the game's opening wasn't just narrative setup, it was pure motivation. The game managed to make you feel the anger and determination of the Lee brothers in a way that few games could at the time. It was interactive cinema before that term even existed. The NES version, developed by Nintendo itself under Shigeru Miyamoto's supervision, was a work of intelligent adaptation. Miyamoto understood that it wasn't enough to simply port the arcade. You had to create something that worked within the limitations and possibilities of the home system. The result was a game that, while different from the original, maintained the essence and added unique elements. The absence of simultaneous cooperative mode was compensated by more elaborate level design and progression, more focused on the single-player experience. The Master System version, on the other hand, offered a visually superior experience to the NES. The graphics were closer to the original arcade, with larger and more detailed sprites. FM sound unit support created a rich and immersive soundtrack that elevated every moment of combat. If Double Dragon was the action movie, River City Ransom was the action movie with a smart script and RPG elements that nobody expected. I remember playing it for the first time and being completely confused and amazed. What? The enemy turned into a coin? I can use this money to buy sushi? And this increases my strength? It was a revelation. The game took the beat-em-up formula and injected a layer of depth and customization that was light years ahead of its time. The genius of River City Ransom was in its freedom. You weren't just pushed to the right. You explored a city, entered shops, bought books to learn new moves, like the legendary Stone Hands or Dragon Feet, and ate to recover life and increase your stats. This progression transformed the game. At the beginning, you were just any brawling student. At the end, you were a superpowered destruction machine, and best of all, it was a machine you built. The comic physics, enemies begging for their lives with a barf, and the possibility of using almost everything as a weapon only added to the charm. This game proves that old beat-em-ups were better because it demonstrated that simple doesn't mean superficial. River City Ransom had basic punch, kick, and jump controls, but underneath this simplicity was a robust RPG system that gave the player agency and a reason to keep playing. The feeling of getting stronger was real and earned. Modern games often overwhelm us with complex systems, but River City Ransom integrated its elements organically and fun, creating one of the most perfect and addictive genre hybrids of all time. In 1990, the Ninja Turtles were the center of the universe for any kid, and Konami achieved the impossible, capturing the chaotic energy and personality of the cartoon in a video game. The NES version of the arcade game was an event. Even with the downgrade from 4 to 2 simultaneous players, the essence was there. The memory of choosing your favorite turtle, Donatello for strategists, Michelangelo for fun, and going out beating Foot Clan members to the sound of that incredible soundtrack is pure nostalgia. The gameplay was Konami at its peak. Fast, fluid, and incredibly satisfying. Each turtle had its range and speed, but all shared an effective set of moves. The jump kick was the universal tool for getting in and out of trouble, and the special attacks that consumed a bit of life were a strategic resource for desperate moments. The game was an explosion of colors and action, with iconic bosses like Rocksteady, Bebop, and Shredder himself, recreating classic moments that made us feel like we were playing an episode of the cartoon. Temment for NES proves the strength of old beat-em-ups by being the purest expression of fun. It was a game that didn't take itself seriously, focused on delivering an accessible, vibrant, and infinitely replayable experience. It was the ultimate power fantasy for any fan. Konami understood the appeal of the license and combined it with pristine gameplay. It didn't need a complex story or revolutionary mechanics. It just needed to be fun to play with a friend, and in that, it was an absolute master. Temment is a title that proves that adaptations can not only work, but elevate the original material to new heights. Decades later, it remains the definition of how to make a perfect cooperative beat-em-up. Renegade is the forgotten grandfather of beat-em-ups, a fundamental influence that often lives in the shadow of its more famous successors. Originally known as Neketsu Kouha Kunio-kun in Japan, this 1986 Technos Japan game established the mechanical and visual foundations that would define an entire genre. The NES and Master System versions brought this revolution to the home environment, each offering unique interpretations of the original concept that demonstrated how different approaches could enrich the same basic formula. The NES version, developed internally by Technos in 1987, took significant creative liberties from the original arcade. Instead of simply replicating the arcade experience, the developers created something that would work better in longer home sessions. The first 3 stages consisted of series of fixed screens where you faced groups of up to 3 enemies at a time, culminating in individual fights against bosses. This segmented structure created a different rhythm, more suitable for the home context where you could pause and resume whenever you wanted. The addition of the motorcycle chase segment in the second stage was a stroke of genius. This moment of pure side-scrolling, where you needed to knock enemies off their bikes before facing the boss, broke the potential monotony of on-foot combat and added mechanical variety that few beat-em-ups of the era offered. It was a glimpse of what would come with games like Road Rash, showing how Technos was always thinking beyond established conventions. The Master System version, released late in 1993 by Natsume and published by Sega, is often considered the best home adaptation of Renegade. This version kept all the expansions of the NES version, but with significantly more defined and colorful graphics. Vigilante is one of the purest examples of what attitude meant in 80s beat-em-ups. Developed by Irem in 1988 and ported to Master System by Sega in 1989, this game perfectly captured the decadent urban aesthetic that defined pop culture of the era. It was a direct product of its time, when movies like Death Wish and The Warriors shaped our conception of urban justice, and when the idea of a lone vigilante cleaning the streets resonated deeply in the collective imagination. Vigilante's premise was deliciously simple and brutal. You controlled an anonymous martial artist whose girlfriend Madonna, or Maria in the Western version, was kidnapped by the Skinheads gang, led by the ominous giant devil. There were no unnecessary narrative complexities, elaborate explanations about motivations, or attempts to humanize the villains. It was pure revenge in its most distilled form, a story that any player could instantly understand and emotionally connect with. The combat system was a direct evolution of what Irem had established with Kung Fu Master. You could move freely around the screen, use punches and kicks in different directions, crouch to dodge attacks and pick up nunchucks from the ground. The nunchuck mechanic was particularly satisfying. They not only increased your attack power, but completely changed the combat dynamics. Losing your weapon when you took a hit added a layer of constant tension, forcing you to balance aggression with caution. The progression through the 5 stages created a journey through urban decay that was both familiar and exotic. Each scenario told its own visual story, from streets infested with punks to the most dangerous territories controlled by the gang. The bosses weren't just mechanical obstacles, but distinct personalities that represented different aspects of urban crime. If Renegade is the grandfather, Kung Fu is the prehistoric ancestor that everyone should revere. This game is simplicity in its purest and most elegant form. I remember afternoons spent trying to master the 5 floors of Mr. X's temple. The premise couldn't be more direct. You, Thomas, need to rescue your beloved Sylvia. Each floor presented new challenges, from thugs who grabbed you to irritating dwarfs, snakes, and fire-breathing dragons. The gameplay was minimalist. 1 punch button, 1 kick button. But the genius was in how these 2 buttons interacted with the directional pad. You could punch and kick standing or crouching. This simplicity forced the player to focus on the essential: timing and positioning. You needed to know exactly when to kick an enemy that was running towards you and when to crouch to punch a dwarf. Every step, every strike was deliberate. The soundtrack was almost non-existent, but the sound effects of the strikes were so iconic and satisfying that they became the game's own music. Kung Fu is the definitive proof that less is more. In an era where games try to impress us with complexity, Kung Fu reminds us that the core of fun lies in a well-designed challenge with responsive controls. It didn't need combos, upgrades, or an open world. It needed 5 floors, enemies with clear patterns, and a precise combat system. Mastering Kung Fu wasn't about memorizing combos. It was about achieving a state of flow, a perfect rhythm of attack and dodge. And that feeling is timeless. Kung Fu is more than a game. It's the DNA of everything that came after. Its influence can be seen in virtually every beat-em-up that followed, from combat mechanics to progression structure. Miyamoto used the work on this game as direct inspiration for Super Mario Bros. And original designer Takashi Nishiyama took these ideas to Capcom, where he created Street Fighter. Released at the end of the NES's life, Mighty Final Fight was a technical miracle and a love letter to fans. The idea of putting the giant Final Fight from the arcade on the modest Nintendo seemed impossible. Capcom's solution was genius. Instead of trying a serious adaptation that would fall short, they embraced the limitations with a chibi or super deformed art style. The result was a game that was not only adorable, but also incredibly solid and, in some aspects, even deeper than the original. What surprised me at the time was that, underneath the cute appearance, there was a robust combat system. Cody, Guy, and Hager were there, each with their characteristic moves. But the big addition was an experience system. By defeating enemies, you gained points that, upon reaching a new level, increased your strength and unlocked a unique special move for each character. This added a fantastic layer of RPG and replayability. Seeing your small and cute character evolve into a combat machine was incredibly rewarding. Mighty Final Fight proves that the creativity of developers in the 8-bit era was unlimited. They didn't see hardware as a limitation, but as a puzzle to be solved. Instead of delivering a watered-down version of the arcade game, they reimagined it, adding new and intelligent mechanics that only worked because of the new presentation. It's a perfect example of how passion and ingenuity could create a rich, deep, and unique experience, proving that the quality of beat-em-ups didn't depend on graphic power, but on the strength of ideas. Mighty Final Fight represents the best of Capcom's development philosophy in the 90s. Instead of simply porting an existing game, they created a new experience that respected the original material while exploring unique creative possibilities. It's a game that proves that technical limitations can be catalysts for artistic innovation, and that reimaginations can be as valuable as originals. Batman Returns arrived on 8-bit consoles in 1992, carrying all the weight and expectation of Tim Burton's film. This wasn't just another licensed game hastily produced to capitalize on cinematic success. It was a genuine attempt to capture the dark and stylized atmosphere that made the film a cultural landmark. The NES and Master System versions offered different interpretations of this vision, each adapting the source material according to the strengths and limitations of their respective platforms. Batman Returns' aesthetic approach was notably darker than most beat-em-ups of the era. Instead of the colorful and cartoonish scenarios typical of the genre, the game opted for dark palettes and decadent urban environments that reflected Burton's Gotham City. It was a production design that took its source material seriously, trying to recreate not just the events of the film, but its psychological atmosphere. The developers understood that Batman wasn't a traditional hero. He was a dark figure operating in an equally dark world. The Master System version stood out for its superior technical quality. The sprites were larger and more detailed, the animations more fluid, and the richer color palette allowed for a more faithful representation of the cinematic visuals. The system could render Batman with all the details of his iconic suit, and the Foot Clan enemies were clearly recognizable. The combat system incorporated unique elements from the Batman universe. You weren't just randomly punching enemies, you were using the Dark Knight-specific combat techniques. The game included the use of Batman's rope for vertical navigation, something few beat-em-ups of the era offered. This mechanic wasn't just a visual gimmick, it fundamentally changed how you moved through scenarios, adding a vertical dimension that genuinely made you feel like Batman. Let's be honest. The first word that comes to mind when talking about Battletoads is difficult. The second is Speeder Bike Tunnel. But before being one of the most infamous games for its difficulty, Battletoads was a phenomenal beat-em-up with overflowing personality. Developed by Rare, the game was a visual and technical marvel, with fluid animations, large sprites, and an irreverent sense of humor that set it apart from everything on the market. The beat-em-up in Battletoads was exaggerated and cartoonish in the best possible way. The final blow of a combo transformed your frog's fist or boot into a comical and giant weapon, a battering ram, an anvil, bullhorns. It was visually spectacular and incredibly satisfying. The game also never let you get comfortable. One stage was a classic beat-em-up, the next was a rappelling descent, then you were on a flying motorcycle, then surfing on a river. This constant variety was both its greatest strength and the source of its legendary difficulty. Battletoads is the final argument for why beat-em-ups were better back then. It represents the audacity and ambition of developers of that era. Rare wasn't content to make just another Ninja Turtles clone. They created their own universe, with innovative mechanics and a level of challenge that demanded absolute perfection. Playing Battletoads wasn't casual entertainment. It was a test of skill, patience, and friendship, since friendly fire was always on. Conquering Battletoads was a badge of honor, and that feeling of overcoming an almost impossible challenge is something that the easy access culture of modern games rarely manages to provide. Well, that was my list. Now I want to know yours. Tell me in the comments. I'll be staying here until next time.